morning everyone. Thank you for joining me in the beautiful basin in the foothills of Mount Dandenong. Before we begin, I would ask you to join me in acknowledging the traditional owners of this land, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. We recognise their connection to the land, waters and culture and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. Today, I've been asked to share with you a little of what I've learned in my current studies in Indigenous perspectives and education. I'd like to start by sharing an observation one of my brother's Indigenous friends made. Growing up in the 60s and 70s, he related that he could never work out why Indigenous men were always portrayed standing on one leg and leaning on their spears. As even when he went spear fishing with his family, he had never seen anyone strike such a pose. He was referring to images like these. The images were part of a trend that began in the 1940s, when artists, designers and publishers began to produce large quantities of material that appropriated from Aboriginal visual culture. Inspired by Indigenous rock art, body paint and cultural objects, and driven by a desire to produce a uniquely Australian aesthetic, they began to produce a myriad of homewares and decorative items. The movement was furthered by the growth of tourism and the marketing of the outback as a tourist destination. The result was the production of a romanticised stereotype of Aboriginal Australia, one that was mass-produced and embraced as part of our national identity. Today, I will explore the impact romanticised stereotyping has had on Australian society and discuss why it is essential that we as educators are aware of the insidious nature of this type of cultural racism. Further, I will discuss how we can guard against its influence on our teaching and actively fight back against the toll it has taken. Mass consumption of derivative Aboriginal imagery brought about a new and insidious form of cultural racism in the 20th century. While not as obvious or aggressive as negative stereotyping, the romanticised stereotype is every bit as effective at reinforcing a Eurocentric framework to the exclusion of Indigenous people. It achieved this by presenting their culture as a homogenised whole, implying that Indigenous people all look and act the same, denying their social and cultural differences. This version of Aboriginality was based on the Central and Northern Indigenous people, where opportunity still existed to view traditional lifestyles. The imagery completely ignored Aboriginals in urban areas living contemporary lifestyles. The 20th century was an era of great change, but the Indigenous people were portrayed as an ancient race trapped in time. This led to the Aboriginal culture being thought of as primitive, simple, Stone Age, with no ability to adapt. There was no recognition of the sophisticated resource management or the complex and balanced social structure that is inherent in Australia's Indigenous population. Another common theme was the close connection between Aboriginal people and native flora and fauna, as depicted on the Australian coins. This simplistic classification of Aboriginal people as Australian fauna was patronising and ignored the complex relationship Indigenous people had and enjoy with the land. Overall, mass culture representation in the 20th century reduced Indigenous people to a primitive, homogenised state, incapable of progressing into modern times. This provided easy justification for the adoption of a paternalistic attitude towards them. Prominent Indigenous artist Tony Alberts highlights this in his work Exotic Other, where he used a collection of 20th century Aboriginalia to spell out the word other. Unfortunately, for the majority of the 20th century, Australian education reinforced this paradigm. In a review of textbooks and resources in New South Wales schools from the 1930s to the 1960s, Keith Crawford found that Indigenous people's lifestyles were presented as being primitive and wild. Their rich linguistic and cultural heritage was reduced to a singular identity and then further distorted by direct comparison with a modern European society. Given the continued exposure to distorted narratives of their history and culture, it is hardly surprising that Indigenous students often developed, as stated by Price, a distrust, disrespect and resistance to schooling. Little was provided to affirm their identities. Instead, they were exposed to paternalism, superior attitudes, and an overemphasis of the exotic. At the same time, non-Indigenous students were continually denied the knowledge they required to challenge and overcome racism, and thus stereotypes became deeply entrenched. Education and popular culture directed a hard focus on the perceived differences between our cultures, instead of encouraging students to identify and appreciate shared characteristics of humanity. Fortunately, in recent decades, educational authorities have taken measures to address this. In the Melbourne Declaration of Educational Goals for Young Australians, the central role of education in building a democratic, equitable and just nation is acknowledged. Indigenous cultures are now recognised as being a key part of the nation's past, present and future. An aim to instil the knowledge, skills and understanding required to support reconciliation has been voiced. But how will this be achieved on a practical level? That is where you and I come in. What can we do as educators to address the ramifications of stereotypes and cultural racism? Firstly, we need to be aware and educated. Craven and Kay tell us that it is our responsibility to stop the cycle of misinformation. This is of such importance that it has been built into the National Teaching Standards. As teachers, we must be able to demonstrate knowledge, understanding and respect for the history, culture and languages of our Indigenous students and comprehend how this impacts on their education. This can be intimidating for those of us who've had limited exposure to Aboriginal culture, but many resources and professional development programs are available to assist. Next, we must utilise teaching approaches which break down stereotypes. We need to teach the truth, taking great care not to unconsciously continue the practice of objectifying Indigenous narratives. It is essential to emphasise that Aboriginal knowledge is localised and is not standard across the country. This is best achieved in consultation with your local Indigenous community. Stories of Aboriginal knowledge presented by local elders will always be preferable to content presented out of context and cut off from the people who own it. To break down the idea that Aboriginals belong to the past and are a primitive culture, we need to teach about present day. We should discuss current issues and promote inspiring Indigenous role models. When we do teach about history, it should be linked to the present, creating an understanding of how history shapes contemporary events. We must encourage our students to look at history from multiple perspectives and search for common traits of humanity that we all relate to. Finally, we should endeavour, guided by the curriculum, to incorporate Aboriginal knowledge into all key learning areas, aiming for it to be taught regularly throughout the year. Delivering content should not be isolated to special occasions. A school that acknowledges Indigenous culture once or twice a year to coincide with NAIDOC Week or Sorry Day runs the risk of promoting a tourist curriculum, where token activities involving traditional decoration and dancing are run, but no provision of context or links to contemporary reality are provided. This approach can sustain the very stereotypes you are fighting so hard to break down. It would be nice in today's politically aware society to think that romanticised imagery of Aboriginal Australia, with its implicit cultural racism, would be a thing of the past. But this could not be further from the truth. In fact, in the 2008 movie Australia, Baz Luhrmann seems to almost glorify the nation's entrenched stereotypes. Here we see the character of King George, the local Aboriginal elder. This imagery is the very epitome of the romanticised stereotype. Please note how many legs he is standing on. Waldron and Newton state that romanticism damages empathetic and solid relationships between differing cultures by exaggerating otherness and hindering the appreciation of commonalities. As educators, we have the power to fight against cultural racism. To achieve this, we must teach holistically, incorporating Aboriginal perspectives into all learning areas and teaching it regularly. We must teach authentically, providing complete and accurate information and involving the local Indigenous community wherever possible. And we must anchor our teaching in the present to ensure that Aboriginal culture is not relegated to the past. We are shaping the citizens of the future. Let's ensure they are provided with the knowledge and understanding they need to create a society we can be proud of.